In the midst of a global power struggle, one country is playing chess while the other is stuck in checkers. The US thought it had the upper hand in the trade war with China. But what happens when the tables turn and they find out they've been played all along? It was a typical morning in Washington, D.C., the sun barely peeking through the clouds, casting a dim glow over the White House. Inside the war room, high-level discussions were underway about the growing trade war with China. The tension was palpable, economic forecasts were grim, and the U.S. was pushing to impose higher tariffs on Chinese goods. "We've got to hit them where it hurts," said the senior economic advisor, a tall, sharp-faced man in his early 50s, tapping his fingers on a folder labeled Tariff Strategy. Across the table, Chris Daniels, a mid-30s African-American senior trade negotiator, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been in the room for hours, watching the strategies unfold, but he was starting to feel something was wrong. "And what about their retaliation?" Chris asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. "China's been quiet, but we know how they operate. They've got a strategy too. What if we're walking right into their trap?" The room went silent. Chris was right. While the U.S. pushed for tariffs, China had remained relatively silent. There had been no outcry, no retaliation, just slow, deliberate moves behind the scenes. In a high-rise in Beijing, China's government officials were preparing their response. But this wasn't going to be a typical back and forth. The Chinese had been quietly developing a counter-strategy that the U.S. wasn't ready for, a strategy that had the potential to flip the trade war on its head. "We need to strike back where it matters the most," said Li Ming, a senior Chinese economist, as he reviewed a report on global supply chains and trade routes. "We know that the U.S. is dependent on rare earth materials, and we control 80% of the global supply. Let's leverage that." The plan was simple. Cut off the U.S. access to rare earth materials, a critical resource for tech manufacturing, electronics, and even defense equipment. By withholding these materials, China could cripple the U.S. tech industry, forcing them into negotiations they couldn't afford to lose. But there was one problem. The U.S. wasn't the only one relying on China for rare earths. Most of the world was. Back in Washington, Chris was starting to connect the dots. Rare earths. That's their play. He knew that China had the power to disrupt global supply chains by controlling critical materials. He had seen the shift in demand and knew that China wasn't just playing a trade game. They were playing a long-term geopolitical chess match. It was a dangerous game, and the U.S. was losing ground fast. The tariffs weren't the problem. The problem was that the U.S. had failed to recognize how much China had outsmarted them. Chris stepped out of the war room and into his office. He needed to make a call. This wasn't just about trade. It was about national security. The next few moves would determine the future of the U.S. economy. As the day went on, the tensions between the U.S. and China escalated. That night, Chris couldn't sleep. He paced around his office, thinking about everything that was at stake. The economy, the industries, the livelihoods of millions of Americans who were now caught in the middle of this war. Suddenly, a knock on the door. Chris opened it to reveal a familiar face, a colleague, Sarah, who had been working on Chinese trade relations for years. "Chris, I've got something you need to see," Sarah said, her face pale. She handed him a leaked document from the Chinese government. Chris read the first few lines, and his heart sank. The document revealed that China had already begun stockpiling rare earth materials, preparing for the worst. They were ready for the U.S. to blink, and when they did, the U.S. would be forced to negotiate terms on China's terms. Chris knew the U.S. was about to face a strategic defeat, but there was one detail in the document that stopped him in his tracks. China had already secured trade agreements with every major global player, cutting the U.S. out of the equation. "This is bigger than we thought," Chris said, his voice low. "They've already won." Chris didn't know who to trust anymore. He looked at Sarah, wondering if she knew more than she was letting on. Had China infiltrated the U.S. at the highest levels? The next day, as Chris made his way to a meeting with the President's Economic Council, he felt a wave of dread. The document, the strategy, it all pointed to one thing. China had outsmarted the U.S., and now they were pulling the strings. As he stepped into the meeting room, a shocking discovery awaited him. A high-ranking U.S. official had been meeting with Chinese diplomats behind closed doors. And worse, it seemed like they had been planning this betrayal for months. Chris couldn't believe what he was seeing. The U.S. had been blindsided by an inside job. The trade war wasn't just about tariffs. It was about control. And China was pulling ahead. Chris stood frozen, staring at the document on the table. The phone rang in his pocket. He knew it was the call he had been dreading. A deal had been made without the U.S. knowing. "This is only the beginning," he whispered to himself. Chris Daniels stared at the file in his hands, his mind racing. Inside the file was proof. A high-ranking U.S. official, someone who had attended countless trade meetings, had secretly met with Chinese diplomats. There, behind closed doors, deals had been struck, and the U.S. was not part of the conversation. He couldn't believe it. Had the U.S. really been outplayed this badly? The sudden realization hit him like a brick wall. Chris wasn't just facing a normal trade war. What he had uncovered was a covert game, a strategy designed not just for tariffs, but for global control. He flipped through the document one more time, scanning the pages carefully. There was a glaring detail. China had secured exclusive access to critical global resources, not just rare earth materials, but entire tech supply chains. The U.S. had made moves to impose tariffs, thinking it would hurt China. But in reality, China had diversified its trade network far beyond U.S. borders, engaging with multiple countries for its own resource needs, leaving the U.S. increasingly isolated. The U.S.'s reliance on Chinese imports, from electronics to pharmaceutical supplies, had set the stage for this very moment. Across the world, economic tensions were bubbling to the surface. In Europe, trade leaders watched the U.S.-China standoff with keen eyes. They had always maintained a delicate balance, but now it was tipping. Countries like Germany and France were adjusting their strategies. The EU had already signed trade agreements with China, securing their position in a changing global economy. In Africa, nations rich in resources such as cobalt and copper, which China had made strategic agreements with, were seeing increased investments from Chinese companies. China wasn't just looking for allies in trade. It was expanding its reach globally. While the U.S. was focused on its ongoing tariff war, China was working tirelessly to secure its future. But the U.S. wasn't blind. As more countries signed deals with China, the U.S. shifted its focus. Technological innovation became their next battleground. If China had economic leverage, the U.S. needed to outpace them with cutting-edge technology and software. Chris knew the next move was critical, and as he stood in front of a wall of economic data, he realized that the U.S. had a choice to make. Either double down on high tariffs or pivot to innovation and try to regain lost ground. Back in Washington, Chris met with a select group of economic and trade advisors to discuss the revelation. The room was filled with tension as proposals flew back and forth. Some were still advocating for harsher tariffs on China's goods, hoping to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. Others, like Chris, were now focused on building alliances with the Pacific nations and strengthening ties with India, an emerging global power with its own growth trajectory. Chris spoke up, trying to make sense of it all. "We've made a critical error," he began. "China's position isn't just about tariffs. It's about control of the global supply chain." One of his colleagues, Jared from the Pentagon, responded, "I don't think we realize the implications of this yet. China has been quietly working on its plan for years." Chris continued, "This isn't just about imposing tariffs on their goods. We have to recognize the infrastructure investments China has made. They've been quietly establishing themselves as leaders in high-tech, clean energy, and resource management. These are the sectors we'll need to focus on moving forward." The room fell silent. Everyone knew that the next few months would be critical. But it wasn't just about trade anymore. It was about how the U.S. would navigate this new geopolitical reality. In Beijing, the economic ministers were well aware of the U.S.'s potential moves. Li Ming, China's top economic strategist, was not surprised by the U.S.'s push for higher tariffs. "It's what we expected," he said. "They will retaliate with force, but we are prepared for that." Li Ming had watched the U.S. try to secure agreements with Europe and the Asia-Pacific region. He knew that China's strength was not in just sheer power, but in how they played the long game. The country had spent years establishing relationships with other trading partners and creating supply chain ecosystems that spanned across Africa, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Let them play their game, Li Ming said, his voice calm but with a sharp edge. We've already won the long game. Now it's time to move on to the next phase. As he spoke, China had already secured new partnerships in Latin America, and now the U.S. found itself scrambling to contain these rapid developments. As China's investments in these regions grew, the influence of the U.S. in global trade slowly began to fade. Back in Washington, Chris knew time was running out. If the U.S. did not shift its focus to innovation and tech infrastructure, China's growing influence would become irreversible. The trade war had escalated into a race for global dominance. And as new deals emerged between China and other countries, Chris realized that this was no longer just a war about tariffs. This was about positioning nations to dominate in the next phase of technological advancement. Suddenly, the phone rang in Chris's office. He picked up quickly. It was from the National Economic Council. Chris, we've got an urgent situation. You need to meet with the president immediately. There's a proposal from China that could change everything. Chris felt the weight of the moment. He had spent months navigating the complex economic fallout of the trade war, and now China was presenting a new proposal, one that could either bring the two powers to the table for a lasting peace, or pull them into an even more dangerous confrontation. As Chris walked down the hall to the president's office, he realized that the trade war was no longer about tariffs. It was about the future of the global economy, and who would control it. As the doors opened, he saw the president sitting behind a desk, looking at the proposal from China. Chris, it's time to make a decision, the president said. Chris took a deep breath. The next words could change everything. Are we ready for what comes next? Chris Daniels stood in front of the president's desk, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. The document from China lay in front of him, thick with details about a global trade partnership that promised to reshape the international economy. The proposal wasn't just a series of trade agreements. It was a blueprint for global influence. The President of the United States, sitting across from him, looked up from the paper and met Chris's eyes. This changes everything, the President said, his voice low, full of gravity. If we accept this, we open a new chapter in U.S.-China relations. But if we reject it, we risk further escalating the trade war, and the economic fallout could be disastrous. Chris felt the weight of his next words. The U.S. was facing a delicate moment. On one side, China had already made strides in securing global trade dominance through strategic partnerships and technological advances. On the other side, the U.S. had its own strengths in innovation, defense, and finance, but could it keep pace with China's growing influence? The decision was looming. Would the U.S. accept China's terms and forge a new future of cooperation? Or would they take a more aggressive approach to defend their global standing? The White House war room buzzed with activity. Chris had just left the president's office and was now meeting with the senior economic advisors, members of the National Security Council, and military strategists. They were preparing for the trade negotiations to unfold, but they were unsure of which way things would go. We can't let this proposal slip through our fingers, said Sarah, one of the lead advisors. She was a sharp, no-nonsense economist who had spent years studying China's rise. If we pass up on this, China will have the leverage, and we'll be at the mercy of their new trade alliances. But not everyone agreed. The terms are too favorable for China, argued Jared, a senior strategist with ties to the U.S. military. We could end up with a weakened position. We need to use our strengths and push back on these trade demands. Chris sat back in his chair, processing the options. What does it mean for the long term? He asked. If we accept, what does our role look like in the global economy? And if we refuse, where does that leave us with our allies and adversaries alike? The room fell silent. The U.S. had to make its move. There was no turning back after this. Meanwhile, in Beijing, Chinese leaders were preparing for the inevitable pushback from the U.S. They knew that the trade war would have its challenges, but they had spent years positioning themselves for this moment. Li Ming, China's chief economist, stood before a large digital screen, displaying maps of the world's trade routes and supply chains. The U.S. may push back, but we have the advantage, Li Ming said calmly, surveying the data. Our partnerships in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia have already begun to pay off. We control key resources, rare earth metals, vital tech components, and now we have strategic ties with the EU and other major markets. This is our moment to solidify our position as a global leader. China had secured key global agreements in areas like infrastructure, energy, and technology. These deals were more than just trade. They were the building blocks of a long-term strategy designed to give China the leverage needed to challenge the U.S.'s role as the world's dominant economic power. But as Li Ming spoke, he knew that the U.S. wasn't out of options. Innovation was still America's trump card. If they focus on their tech industry, he mused, they could still turn the tide. But only if they act fast. Chris knew the U.S. had to fight back with innovation, but it wasn't just about tech. It was about making sure the U.S. didn't lose its grip on global economic leadership. The U.S. economy had been built on free market principles, but now it was dealing with the consequences of a globalized world. As China had strengthened its hand with massive infrastructure projects and technological advancements, the U.S. needed to ensure its tech sector remained competitive. But the question lingered, could the U.S. adapt in time? In a meeting with key Silicon Valley executives, Chris brought up a harsh truth. We've been focusing on defense and financial markets, but China is winning the race in renewable energy and green tech. If we don't accelerate our push in these sectors, we might lose even more ground. The room was divided. Some executives were eager to invest more in clean energy and next-gen tech, but others were focused on maintaining their hold on traditional sectors like finance and defense contracts. The hours ticked by, and the trade talks with China loomed closer. Chris sat in his office, alone with his thoughts. What would happen next? He knew that the decision being made today would shape the future of the global economy. The U.S. had a lot to lose, but it also had a chance to innovate and adapt. Would they take the deal, or would they double down on tariffs and risk further isolation? As he picked up his phone, Chris saw an incoming call from the president. He answered immediately. Chris, we need to make a final decision. We can't wait any longer. What's it going to be? The president's voice was firm, but Chris could hear the pressure in his tone. Give me a few more hours, Chris said, his mind racing. We need to get this right. The world watched as the final trade negotiations between the U.S. and China unfolded. The decisions made today would ripple across the world economy, with countries watching closely to see which direction the two superpowers would go. Would the U.S. accept China's offer and open a new chapter of cooperation? Or would it risk a more dangerous path, doubling down on tariffs and risking further trade war escalation? As Chris sat back in his chair, one final question loomed. Will the U.S. adapt in time, or will China lead the charge in the future of the global economy? What do you think? Should the U.S. accept China's proposal to cooperate or continue fighting the trade war? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's discuss how this trade war could reshape the future of global business. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more updates.